The name of this, oh, I just got another thing. Oh, here we go. Good, it went away. Yeah, the name of this is Ecological Landscaping. What, why, how now? England already stole the first 5 minutes of my presentation, but a brief introduction. I'm a gardener. I have been, I think the day that kind of made me a gardener was the day that my younger sister Janet brought kohlrabi out of the garden into the kitchen. And I mean, these things look like flying saucers. Mom never brought this home from the grocery store. And it just kind of opened my eye to the fact that when you take a seed and you put it in the ground, there's no end to the wonders that can take place. And I've pretty much been a gardener one way or another ever since. When I was in 1981, I was in my late 20s. I moved to Southeast Kansas. And I was working in the oil patch at the time. But I discovered that you could, in Southeast Kansas, you could do things with plants that I had never done before that were wonderful. And eventually I got the job at Riverside Park and Zoo, or Riverside Park and Ralph Mitchell Zoo as the gardener, where I did a lot of showy stuff with annuals, which allowed me to have people leave me alone to where I could do what I enjoyed, which was working with native perennial plants. Because, I mean, look at the color on that thing. It just matches the sky almost. Native plants are so wonderful, and I really enjoyed that. Eventually, because the park has a zoo, I belong to a national zoo horticulture organization, and I met Christine Nye, who was the horticulturist at the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago. And in 2008, I married her, moved to Illinois, where I got to work on projects like this, in places like this, with people who work so hard that it was hard to ever get a picture of their face. Because, and this was really refreshing for me. When I first lived in Kansas, I worked with people in the oil patch who were incredibly hard workers. But that situation changed over time. And when I started working with these guys, it really rejuvenated me. It was a wonderful thing. So what, why, how now? What and why are pretty closely connected. So I'm going to tackle those together. First of all, what it's not. And this is pretty much all I knew when I left Kansas about ecological landscape is not planting invasive species. This is a Callery pear, and here's a whole row of Callery pears growing down the edge of this farm field. When you have two different varieties of Callery pear, like a Bradford pear and a Chanticleer pear or a Cleveland pear growing in the same area, then you get viable seed and they start taking over areas. I know that 15 years ago, there was a large area on both sides of Highway 75, just north of Sycamore, completely taken over. And all across, I see nodding heads. So yeah, it's still there, huh? When the Bradford pears bloom this spring, take a drive up north of Sycamore. And boy, it's incredible. They are really getting aggressive around the country, and people are starting to realize they have to address this because they're wiping out native ecosystems. And some other common Southeast Kansas invasive species. When I worked at the park, I spent at least a month every winter going through the woodlands, killing the Asian honeysuckles, burning bush, barberry. There were sweet autumn clematis that were growing up over the top of 30-foot pecan trees and just killing them. And the purple leaf winter creeper just dominates the understory along the Vertigus River, and also my property where I lived on Rock Creek, southwest of town. Very aggressive stuff. And none of the native understory is surviving the onslaught of these. So when I left Kansas, that's what I knew about ecological landscaping is don't grow this stuff. But what I since then, I've learned a new definition, which I call cultivating the gifts of the sun. What on earth am I talking about? Gifts of the sun, I call it breath, food, and beauty. So plants do this crazy thing. You guys might have heard about it. They take carbon dioxide and water, and they make oxygen and sugar. I mean, every day that blows my mind. Every day more, it blows my mind more than it did the day before. And they take this sugar and they transform it into all kinds of other things. On the back of this wasp is pollen, which is the most perfect food there is. And the amount of pollen produced in the world, a tiny, tiny fraction of it is used for pollinating anything. Most of it is used for feeding things, mostly for feeding insects. The main way that the solar energy that gets transformed by plants to chemical energy, the main way it gets moved into the animal kingdom is through the action of insects. So they're critical to this whole thing. And, you know, there are bees that have mouth parts that only fit one species of plant. So that bee is only active as an adult during the few weeks of the year that that plant is blooming. The rest of the year, it's either an egg, a larva, or a pupa. So we need to provide habitat for these creatures, not just when they're adults. A pollinator garden isn't just something that feeds pollinators when they're pollinating, but we have to feed them throughout their life cycle by recreating habitat for them, because we're wiping it out, and that's not a good thing. E.O. Wilson, the late E.O. Wilson, called insects and spiders qualify as the little creatures that run the world, and they really are. They're so critical. Aphids. This is aphids on swamp milkweed. Often in my yard, early in the season, my swamp milkweed will get inundated with aphids, and that always makes me happy because there are a lot of different insects that live off of aphids. And I know when I see this, that those populations are getting ramped up to where this spirals out throughout the landscape, and it's going to make the whole landscape more resilient to onslaughts of other things through the years. If you see aphids and you know have to go grab something and kill them, you're ruining that whole process. So please don't do that. The pollinate, the butterflies are a big deal. I'd like to mention that there are 15 times as many moth species as there are butterfly species. So, butterflies get all the press, but the moths do most of the work. And we need to create habitat for every stage of their life cycle. Monarchs get a whole lot of press, which is a wonderful thing. I call them a gateway insect, get people interested in this kind of stuff. And again, we have to support them in every stage of their life cycle. The caterpillars are special for two things in particular. One, they're host specific. Monarchs can only eat milkweed. Fritillaries can only eat violets. This goes on and on. And these are only, nothing will eat a Norway maple. Nothing will eat a ginkgo tree. And the caterpillars are the primary food source for baby birds. Most of our songbirds feed their babies almost nothing but caterpillars. A chickadee weighs a third of an ounce, little tiny bird. A pair of chickadees are going to typically lay 6 or 7 eggs. And from the day those eggs hatch till the day the birds leave the nest is about 17 days. And in that 17 days, those two birds are going to have to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. They can't be traveling long distances. They can't go down the block to get these. There isn't enough time. Think of that. That many caterpillars in 17 days. These plants have to be nearby in order for this to work. These pictures are not mine. These are taken by Doug Tallamy, who popularized this idea about 20 years ago. with Bring Nature Home. If you're interested in this stuff, this is where you start, is by reading Tallamy's Bring Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, is an update that's excellent. He wrote or co-wrote a couple of other books, and I wish I had read these when the first one, when it first came out. I wasted a lot of time trying to figure out this stuff on my own when it was all put down very beautifully by Dr. Tallamy. And he's the nicest guy in the world. And this whole business of making sugar, oxygen and sugar, gets fed to the soil microbes, which are incredibly important for making everything work, because a third of this sugar produced by plants is pumped out through the root tips and fed to the microbes. The microbes in exchange bring nutrients and water to the roots. And when the microbes digest the sugar, the waste product is plant growth hormones, which are taken back up. Don Schnurbush at Independence Community College told me these hormones were produced in the root tips, and he was just a couple millimeters off. It was just outside the root tips. The microbes were doing it. And that's the only reason the plants are growing, is because they're getting these growth hormones. So it all works together. And also in the ground, with your prairie plants in particular, you have these root systems that can go 15 feet down, and then in the wintertime, they die back part way. This leaves organic matter in the ground, which makes it more sponge-like. So stormwater travels through the ground instead of on top of it. It shouldn't be traveling on top of the ground. You see over on the left there, you'll see turf grass. It's not doing much. And this organic matter left in the ground is carbon-based. And this is carbon sequestration at its best, as long as we leave the soil alone. Because when you disturb the soil, carbon is released. When you don't disturb the soil, it stays there. We want it to stay there. You guys might have heard about this. Okay, so how? That's pretty much what and why. A lot of this, I'm just going to give you some examples, and we're going to have question and answer period later. If you have other ideas, other thoughts. But how is pretty much site prep, design, planting, and maintenance. Site prep is killing stuff. Your soil's fine in most cases. I mean, there's situations where it's been poisoned or something, but for the most part, your soil's good enough. Plants build soil. It's not the other way around. So you don't have to go around adding all kinds of stuff to your soil if you're trying to grow native plants. Let the plants take care of that. Just get them in the ground. But in most cases, site prep just means killing stuff. If all you got to kill is turf grass, that's pretty easy, because turf grass is barely alive to start with. It's about worthless stuff. You can kill it with, there's various smothering methods, lasagna recipes, whatever, where you put newspaper, cardboard down, put wood chips on top of that. That'll kill turf grass. It'll kill creeping Charlie, clover, shallow rooted stuff. But you see those dandelions there? They're not going to die. That newspaper is going to rot away, and the dandelions will come right up through. You can smother with plastic. It works for turf grass, but again, not for a lot of other stuff. This is a glyphosate Roundup-like application to an acre that we're transforming to prairie, seeded prairie. And this, so for a big area, that was the only practical way to do it. But it's not going to kill everything. There are a lot of things that are really hard to kill. Some of them we grow on purpose. I'm not going to name every one of them, but bishop's weed is also called gout weed. A lot of these are very popular old-fashioned gardening plants that are, hard to kill. I had gooseneck loosestrife in one bed at the park. I worked for 10 years to kill that stuff. Just tried method after method after method. And I think I got rid of it finally. But, and hostas and daylilies can be hard to wipe out. And if they're already in an existing garden, they're going to dominate. And so you're going to want to get rid of them. I had a situation right next to my house in my neighbor's yard where almost everything on that list that I just showed you was in this area. And it was always the flowers you see on the right edge, that's my property line. And this stuff was always creeping into my yard. And I got permission from the homeowner next door to try something on this. And what it was a big pile of fresh wood chips, fresh green wood chips. Doesn't matter what kind of tree, it doesn't matter if it's diseased. What matters is it's alive, it's green, and that the day it's chipped up, I heard a chipper running in my neighborhood, and I went over there and asked the guys if they needed a place to dump, and they said sure, and they dumped it here. I took about an afternoon and spread it out. I'm kind of slow these days, so it took me a whole afternoon to spread that load out, about 1.5 feet thick. Seriously. I did this in July. The next summer, a few things came up, but not much. And I hoed those out or pulled them out, and they quit trying to come back. The stuff was wiped out, except for the field bindweed. It's terrible stuff. It can grow root systems 30 feet deep, and it just kept coming back and coming back. So I got another load of wood chips, dumped on top of another foot on top of everything. Not on everything, but where the bindweed was coming up, I put another foot on it, and it quit. This last year, there was no bindweed that came up through this. Now, this obviously isn't a garden, and it's going to take a while before this breaks down enough that I can start planting into this. But it takes patience to do this well, to kill these really persistent weeds. And if you want something that looks like that, you can't have goutweed and lamium and all this other stuff growing in there. It just isn't going to work. So you've got to take your time and kill it really dead. So that's prepping a site. Designing a landscape, you want three objectives. You want to be able to feed insects, you want it to look intentional, and you want it to be easy to maintain. So feeding insects, there are various methods to feed, things that you can do, resources for you to learn how to better feed insects with your landscapes. The Xerces Society, XER, XES Society, they have a website with a lot of good resources on how to pick plants that are the most ecologically functional. Native Plant Finder, if you just Google Native Plant Finder, it will take you to this page. And what you do is where it says set location, you click on that, and then you put in your zip code. So what I did was I clicked on that. I put in 67301 for Independence, Kansas, and then selected Find Native Plants. And it gives you 2 lists. One of them is trees and shrubs. And what this is telling you is that oaks, the genus Quercus, in Independence, Kansas, support 242 different kinds of caterpillars. That's a lot. That's a lot of diversity. And so if you have a failure of one kind of caterpillar, you're going to have others. And so those are what Doug Tallamy calls the keystone species. So if you have a few of these around in your yard, it makes a big difference as far as how many caterpillars. Again, most of these are moths. And if you click on that page, on that spot where it says oak, it'll list the different caterpillars. It's a great resource. And it goes down through all the way down to, trees and shrubs that only support one. The other list that it gives you is flowers and grasses. The goldenrods are the champions, 77 different species of caterpillar supported by the goldenrods. They're so important. They do not cause allergies. Their pollen is heavy and sticky. It does not travel on the wind. It is transported by insects. And it's very important because they bloom late in the season to have goldenrods. There's some that you don't want, we'll talk about later. But look at this list. Wild strawberries in Independence, Kansas support 56 kinds of caterpillars. Why not plant wild strawberries underneath everything in your yard? Why not? I mean, it's going to help. You want it to look intentional. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a good example of a landscape that looks intentional. I used to work at this place and I did very little work. What makes it look intentional is that you have big blobs of stuff, like big masses of different colors. Something about the way we're hardwired that if you look at a landscape and you don't understand it, if it's too messy, somewhere deep within our genetic code, we think a saber-toothed tiger is going to step out of there and eat us. And, you don't want to scare your neighbors. I advocate planting these gardens in your front yard. Backyards we use for a lot of other things. We have dogs in them. We grow vegetables in them. Kids play ball in them. But the front yard is just for show. So why not show them something? And this is, big masses of color really make an impression, makes the landscape look intentional. Repetition of these masses of color really makes a landscape look intentional. And, this is my front yard. It's pretty chaotic looking, but because of the repetition of the yellow and the repetition of the pink, it makes it seem intentional and it ties it together into a more coherent composition. But this place, the thing about it is that it was always incredibly easy to maintain. I would go there every couple of weeks and I wouldn't have to do anything. There were never any weeds. I never understood why. And then at the end of that season, I saw a presentation by Thomas Rayner, who with his collaborator, Claudia West, wrote this book, which Doug Tallamy calls the universal how-to guide to sustainable landscaping we have all been waiting for, a masterful accomplishment. And it really is. They explain a lot of things. I recommend this book highly. They're great people. And they advocate that you design and plant in layers, that you start with your structural layer, which is, often existing things like trees and shrubs, maybe a gazebo, anything that's large, even your house is part of the structural layer. And then you play off of that with swaths and drifts of the kind of color that I showed you pictures of before that will change throughout the season. But the magic part, as far as I'm concerned, is underneath all of this is a ground cover layer, a cool seat. You cover the ground with cool season plants so that in April and May, and even in March and April, where I keep forgetting where you people are, in March and April, when the weeds are germinating, the ground's already covered. You don't have to go buy mulch every year and put it down. The ground's already covered with stuff early in the season. And this makes it easy to maintain. I went to this talk and the next week I went back to this property and I saw the homeowner and I, was really excited about these new ideas that I'd learned. And I told her about them. And then we walked around her property and realized that was the secret to her landscape. And she didn't even realize it. She had just done this kind of intuitively. But you see, there's hardly any bare ground showing. She had planted ajuga and sedums and different kinds of geranium, not all native plants, but ground cover plants and cool season ground cover plants. And that's why she never had any weeds. That's why when I would go there, there would never be any work for me to do. But it's better to do these with native plants. So what are some examples of native plants? Well, the sedges, the genus Carex, grass-like plants of the genus Carex are very important in our landscapes, in our natural habitats. One of their functions is that early in the season, when the ground is saturated from snow melting, and it's half frozen or whatever, and it's been raining because it's springtime, assuming we have rain that spring, it can actually drown your oak trees and a lot of different things. But the sedges are most metabolically active here early in the season. and they're pumping water out of the ground into the air and allowing the roots of the other plants not to drown and rot. And then later in the season, in the summer, they're completely dormant. They're not doing anything except every night they're standing there waving back and forth, collecting dew and putting it in the ground. I have a friend who's a permaculturist who underplants everything in her perennial food gardens. She underplants everything with sedges, and she has to water less because in the heat of the summer, they're not using up any water. They're actually adding water. So sedges are amazing. You have to be careful. There are some that are aggressive and ugly. So be careful about which ones. This is Carex pennsylvanica, also called oak sedge or pen sedge, which is really getting a lot of sun coming in. Whoops. Okay, yeah, pen sedge that I lost myself. Okay, so yeah, Carex pennsylvanica is good. Some other sedges, albicans and rosea are clump-forming sedges that that are beautiful. The James sedge, is very much like the Carex pennsylvanica. The Pennsylvanica turns brown in the summer, which can be really pretty. The Jamesii does not. So you want to stay with short sedges. Palm sedge is one that I've used that I do not recommend anybody ever using. It's just too messy, and it ruins the fancy term is the legibility of your composition. It just ruins it, and you can't tell what's going on, and it makes it scary looking. So some other things, pussy toes. I know they grow in Southeast Kansas. I've seen them in the prairies there. You put them in a landscape, they grow very densely. This is in May when they're blooming. They cover the ground very early. The purple poppy mallow, oh yeah, we got fancy names too. Purple poppy mallow, which early in the season lays flat on the ground, prevents weeds from coming up. Then as the season goes on, they kind of stand up and put on that show. This is called robin's plantain. And this is the sedge, the grassy looking stuff on either side of it is the Carex albicans that I mentioned before that grows in clumps. But the robin's plantain covers the ground very densely. This is in the summer, but early in the year, it's green. Here it is in May, starting to put up the flower heads. It has these pretty little daisy flowers. But this is a big planting of it. This is in Camden Yard, Baltimore, Maryland, right outside of Orioles Stadium. Thousands of people walk by here, trample on this. This is a 10-year-old planting that does not receive any maintenance, and it's just dominating. There are no weeds growing in here. You can see there's no maintenance because the straw looking stuff, those are the flower stems from this is in September when I took this. It bloomed in May. Nobody cleaned up the flower stems, so it's messy looking, but boy, it prevents the weeds, covers the ground very densely. This is golden ragwort, which these are second-year plants in May, starting to put up flower heads to bloom. But this is another population. This again is at Camden Yard in Baltimore, and 10-year-old planting that doesn't get maintenance. You know, there's not even a curb there. You know, this gets trampled on. Everything else has been killed off, but it's surviving and it's preventing weeds. Our native violets are great for this. This is a place in my yard where we just went in and planted some native shrubs and shaded out the lawn. Didn't even kill the lawn, just shaded it out. And then the violets just came in and took over, and they're beautiful in May when they're blooming. Since I took this picture, this stuff has thinned out because it's getting really shady now. So we're planting in our native wild ginger, which forms, as you can see, a very dense mass. You're not going to get any weeds coming up in there. But my favorite is called prairie smoke. And I don't know it's not native to Kansas. It's not even native to Nebraska, but it grows in hot, dry places. And I don't know why it wouldn't grow there. This is in April when the daffodils are blooming, and it's in full bloom. Here in Northern Illinois, England said Chicago, but I'm a long ways from Chicago. I'm just a stone's throw from the Wisconsin border. And full bloom in April. Here it is in June when it's putting out the seed heads, which is where it gets its name, prairie smoke. And here it is on the right is in July after it's done. And within a couple of weeks after I took this picture, I went through and cleaned out all the flower stems. Just took 15 minutes maybe, because it finally, after 4 years of being absolutely beautiful, 4 months of being absolutely beautiful, it finally got kind of nasty looking. So I cleaned those out. And then the rest of the year, this provides pathways where I can walk. I don't walk in there a lot, but when I do, I walk right on top of the prairie smoke. And what these ground covers do is so many native gardens get so messy looking because the plants are so close together, but this provides separation between the different plants so that as the other things get bigger, you can tell the difference from one plant to the next. And it just makes it a lot, it preserves the legibility of your composition, which just makes it prettier. Here on the left, we have our native alum root. It's heuchera. It's our native heuchera. Coral bells, which blooms early in the year. It blooms probably in June, but it covers a lot of ground early in the season, as do our native geraniums. Early in the season, they get the ground covered. And you can mix these things. Think of your composition like a Persian rug, where from a distance you want to see the big, bold patterns, but as you get closer and closer, your eye really enjoys all the little intricate details. And the combinations are just wonderful. And by mixing them together, you get different shaped root systems in the ground, where all that good stuff in the ground gets to take place. So planting, keep it small. If you're planting this many plants and they were all in gallon pots, how much potting soil did you just buy? There's no reason to do that. You plant, I know I used to buy plants up at Arnold's greenhouse, and they would sell stuff in pretty small containers, which is definitely the way to go as far as I'm concerned. You want to disturb the soil as little as possible when you put the plants in the ground. So a smaller container is going to be better. Here we're using a power auger to make the holes, which makes it a lot faster and easier to get these things in the ground. You can buy an attachment like this that goes on a power drill. Use some extension cords and make a lot of holes really fast. Get these things in the ground. You want to get the top of the plug completely covered, especially on herbaceous plants. You don't want them sticking up. You know how a tomato, you can plant it deep. Well, you can plant these a little bit deep too. So that's herbaceous stuff. Woody plants. This is an oak tree that I transplanted. You see, it has a nice big taproot, and people get real excited about taproots. Taproots are important for the first 3-4 years of an oak tree's life, to have storage for when a deer browses it down or it gets burned off by a fire or something. But what's going to sustain this tree for decades, or hopefully for centuries to come, is not that taproot. It's not mining water from deep down in the ground. It's feeding itself on the lateral roots that are close to the system, close to the surface. This has been established conclusively, that the more roots you have in the first few inches of the top of the soil, the more vigorous a tree is going to be. Interestingly enough, the pioneering research in this was done at Oklahoma State University by a guy named Carl Whitcomb. who grew up, as he described to me, in a series of rented farms between Cherryvale and Neodesha. Any Tuckers who were in the group who have had Easter, Thanksgiving dinner with Aunt Marie Whitcomb, that's Carl's mother. He was actually named after Carl Sr. But it's real stuff. And Carl invented the pot that you see on the left here. These are air root pruning containers. I'm not going to go into detail on how they work, but they give you a root system like you see on the right here, which is much better. The root system that you see on the left is no good. That tree will fail eventually in your landscape. The one on the right will thrive in your landscape. Carl's quite a character. When I saw him do a presentation, he said, I got into this business. We were looking for a way to plant it, to grow a tree that all you had to do is plant it green side up and it'll grow. And we're there. And we thought he was out of his mind. And he's not. He knows what he's talking about. So you want to plant trees and shrubs, either bare root or grown in air root pruning containers. You're only going to get these from specialty growers. If you go to your garden center and they do not have trees and shrubs grown in air root pruning containers, tell them that's what you want and go someplace else. I don't know where they're available around where you live, but they're getting more and more available where we shop. So maintenance. Maintenance is basically watering, weeding, and then whatever you're going to do in the spring and fall, which we will talk about. Watering, you know, an established native garden almost never requires water. My front yard hasn't been watered in years, except when I put a new plant in there. New gardens, you want to keep them evenly moist, but not really wet. You don't want to drive the oxygen. The roots need oxygen. You don't want to drive the oxygen. When you water in a new garden, you don't want to stand there with a hose in one place. You want to keep moving, spray the water around, water here, water there, go someplace else, go get a drink, come back, spray more water around, slowly moisten the ground. You're looking for moist. You can't tell by looking at the plant whether it's too wet or too dry. You have to dig into the soil and find out. And if you happen to be someplace with an irrigation system, then turn that sucker off. If you need to use it, if you want to water things, go turn it on. It doesn't have a heart. It doesn't have a brain, really. It doesn't have a soul. It doesn't know what's going on in your landscape. A timer isn't going to fix that. You need to, you know, when you want to use it, turn it on. When you want to, you know, and then turn it off, because you ruin a lot of landscapes with too much water. Water when there's forecast calls for rain. Rain has oxygen and nitrogen dissolved in the drops. If it hits moist soil, that stuff goes right into the ground. When the ground's too dry, it just airs out and goes away. So why have that? Our vegetable garden, we water it every time. If it's been hot and dry and there's a storm forecast to come in, that's the day I water lightly, you know, get the ground moist. And then the rain does so much more good. And remember that plant roots need oxygen just as much as they need water. Just never forget that. Weeds are fun. Here on you see, this is prairie petunia, a great native plant. I use the bed right there by the front of the black locomotive. I grew these in there because they're tough. And that's a really tough place. It gets that hot afternoon sun. I don't know if there's a garden there anymore, but they used to have a nice one, and with mostly native plants. But this is a plant that we put it into our yard, and eventually we decided it was just too aggressive and it was ruining the legibility of our composition. And it was wiping out, oops, didn't mean to do that. It was wiping out other things. So now I call it a weed. But I don't mind if there's a few growing, they're beautiful. And when I see one blooming, I sure don't tear it out right away. I let it bloom. I let it drop seed. It's okay. The little clover looking stuff, that's oxalis, wood sorrel. It's a weed, but in that picture, it's pretty. When it gets to where it's not pretty, then it's an issue. when it gets to where it's going to drop a lot of seed, then it might be an issue. But if you're doing this right, a little seed isn't going to be that much of a problem. There's some weeds that are just so persistent, we need to make our peace with them, like Creeping Charlie. You know, Creeping Charlie is what grows along the ditch in the ravine at the park, in the zoo. And it does a great job there. And if you can keep Creeping Charlie out of your garden, power to you. You know, I've had gardens without Creeping Charlie. And if you don't have it, and somebody who has Creeping Charlie in their garden wants to give you a plant, say no thank you, or keep it in a pot for a year and make sure it doesn't have Creeping Charlie in it, because you don't want it in your garden. But if it's there, you're not going to beat it. You know, don't pick fights you can't win. And so, you know, you're just going to have to find a way to live with it. Tear it out when you're working in a spot, rip it out, but you're not going to get it. You just aren't. The wood sorrel, you know, when it's ugly, get rid of it. When it's not, nutsedge, you know, nutsedge, it seems like the harder you work against nutsedge, the harder it works against you. If you don't stress about it, it's just isn't that much of a problem. Black medic, also called yellow hop clover, covers the ground very nicely, doesn't get big, doesn't interfere. Why bother? And prairie petunia has entered this category in my yard. That just happened this year. I used to consider it a desirable plant. Now I'm calling it a weed that I've made my peace with. There are good reasons to kill weeds. It's ugly, ruins the legibility of the composition. It's about to produce a lot of seed, or it grows aggressively by underground stems, rhizomes, and we'll give you an example of that in a minute. But all the other reasons are bad. Oh, I hate that plant. Just get over it. You know, that's not a reason to be going to a lot of extra work that isn't really going to make any difference. These are rhizomes, a plant growing by underground rhizomes, underground stems. You get something like this growing in your landscape and it can really cause a lot of problems. So you want to get these out, and you want to get them out while they're small. This is, I'm not sure, it's a goldenrod. It's either Canada goldenrod, Missouri goldenrod, or tall goldenrod. It's a rhizomatous goldenrod. It spreads by these underground stems. This is a first-year plant, and it's already a foot spread on the rhizomes there. A second-year plant will have hundreds of rhizomes for feet across, and will take over your landscape. And so it's a very innocuous looking thing. You don't really, it doesn't seem evil when you see it. So it's hard to realize that when you see that, get that search image, you got to get that out of the ground. You want to get it out of the ground while it's small, because that way you have less soil disturbance, and less soil disturbance equals fewer weeds. There are weed seeds in your soil, and every time you disturb the soil, you bring them to the surface, and they need sunlight to germinate. So the less you can disturb the soil, the easier everything is. And the less you disturb, these guys are the hardest workers in your garden. You want to be as nice to them as you can. So disturb the soil as little as possible. So these are the tools that I use. I'll give you a demonstration on these hoes. The principle behind all these tools is that you work as shallowly as possible. I use a soil knife, which is much better than any kind of trowel, a pruner's and a spade. You might wonder, what's a pruner's got to do with weeding? Well, little trees. This is a Siberian elm. The arrows are where the soil line was. I took my pruners, plunged them in the ground, cut that off an inch below the soil line. It's done. It's not coming back. Not all trees are like that, but most trees are. And that way I haven't had to pull the whole thing out of the ground, causing all that soil disturbance, which makes everything easier. Yeah, I get repetitive with this. So here we go with, hopefully this is going to work. Yes, this is me using one of these Dutch hoes, and they're wonderful. You just shave the surface of the earth with them. You're not tilling up the ground. This is a vegetable garden, so I'm killing everything. I'm leaving most of the roots in the ground where they'll decompose and feed my vegetables, but you just use this thing to shave the surface of the earth. You don't dig, you're not digging at all. Oops. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay. So you don't want to, but you don't want to kill everything. Here we see a bunch of coneflowers and this grassy looking stuff growing in between them. What the heck is that? Well, it turns out that that's Liatris, which is an absolutely wonderful plant, probably the best plant there is for attracting butterflies and probably moths too. But when you look at this, one thing you know for sure is you don't need that many of them. So you need to thin that out. Well, here's an example where I came along a spot and there's a whole bunch of something coming up. I wasn't absolutely sure what it was, but very nearby, there was this that I knew was a penstemon. So I figured these were probably penstemons also, but I knew I didn't need that many of them. So I took my hoe and, I could have transplanted some of these or, potted them up or something, but this is 1 square foot. And the day that I did this, I maintained tens of thousands of square feet of garden on different properties. And so I took my hoe and 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. In less than 5 seconds, I thinned that out. I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks. I might thin it out a little more, but that's all it takes. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. And it's thinned out. And that'll be a nice little population of penstemons sometime. If I had a lot of time, yeah, I would have transplanted them and water them. I don't even know where the water faucets are on this property. So that's what I did. Oops, this thing, okay. So remember, what happened here? No. Yeah, get them while they're small. So let's talk about cleaning up the garden. No, let's not talk about, don't clean up your garden, ever, ever. You need to cut it back. You need to leave the leaves. This is the biggest issue that the garden club and I had at the park. They always wanted to remove all the organic matter from my gardens when they did cleanup days. And I said, hey, it's already mulched. What are you doing? Just leave it alone. And the leaves, here's a good reason to leave the leaves. This is a comma butterfly, which overwinters as an adult butterfly in leaf litter. They can their caterpillars can live on most kinds of native trees. So in the winter, in the spring, they're adults just hanging out in the leaf litter, waiting to go up, lay eggs. Those eggs will become caterpillars, which are food for the first generation of baby birds in your garden. If you're using a rake or a leaf blower or just going in with a mower or doing anything, you're killing these. They're fragile. You don't want to do that. This is Polyphemus moth. The picture on the right was taken by Doug Tallamy. He sent it to me because, as I mentioned before, he's the nicest guy in the world. And these things generally they grow on the tips of trees. They look like leaves, but frequently they break off and they're in the leaf litter. You want to leave them alone. You don't see Polyphemus moths very often because they operate at night. This is a Luna moth, and that's the cocoon on the left there. You would never notice that if you were out raking leaves. Just leave the leaves, please. Yeah, those pictures are from Doug Tallamy. So in my front yard, this is March in my front yard. It seemed like a really good idea the previous fall to leave everything standing for winter interest, but by March it's looking pretty beat up. In about 20 minutes, I changed it to that, just using some hedge pruners. That's all I used. Yeah, it's not completely done. It's not pretty, but it's prettier than it was. That big Baptisia that looks blackish in the middle, that's going to have to come out someday. But, at this point in the season, it's at least something to look at. and it's still March. I've still, March here, you've still got winter coming. You want to leave stems on things because a lot of insects, a lot of bees and beetles use the stems to nest in. Sometimes they use stems that are 2 and 3 years old. So you have to be strategic about where you leave stems standing. But it's important to leave standing stems. And yeah, this isn't the most, oh, here we go. This is the incomparable Horacio Suarez taking down a big switchgrass in 1 minute and 22 seconds with a weed whacker. I prefer using like an electric hedge trimmer to do this, battery powered hedge trimmer. It's a lot quieter, but 1 minute and 22 seconds, and that thing's completely gone. It's mulch. The whole garden is mulched already. This is the whole bed that had 10 of these big switchgrass in it. In a half an hour, he cleaned up the whole thing, and all the organic matter is left there. Most of the seeds and a larva and stuff that, I mean, not seeds, but eggs of different insects that were in there are still there. No doubt some things got killed in this process, but this was at a school, and, they sure want it cleaned up some way, and they allowed us to do it this way, and it's a lot better. Here's my yard. Yeah, there it is in March. It isn't real pretty at this point, but it's not going to be very long, and it's going to look like that. So you just have to, hold off. They'll grow. They'll be back. Whoops. Oh, and we're to now. To talk about now, I want to talk about the past a little bit. This woman, Andrea Wolf, she took a deep dive into the letters between the first 4 presidents of the United States and how they wrote, the things that they wrote to each other and the things that they wrote to other people too. And it's pretty interesting because the most common topic of all the things that they had to talk about was horticulture. That's what they were really interested in. And eventually what you find, especially in the writings of George Washington, is that everything these guys did, from revolution, independence, years-long diplomatic missions to Europe, writing the Constitution, forming a government and governing, their motivation for doing this was that so they could go home and garden. It's what they really cared about. And so that you and I could go home and garden, because of all, these are pretty independent-minded people, and they disagreed on just about everything, except that they all believed that the flora of North America would provide for great prosperity. That's a term that Washington used a lot, prosperity for the people, using the native plants. So they were all engaged in experiments with native plants. They were using exotics also, but a lot of experiments with native plants to see what they could do, and they shared their findings with each other. It's one place where they all came together and had the same belief system. They shared their findings. They formed a community of gardeners. And in many ways, our nation was based on a community of gardeners. And one thing that you find, and I found many times different projects going on in the Chicago area, is that community gardening builds community in ways that other things just cannot. Here's a project in a little community near me where some people got together and started a project, and it created a result that was so much more than the sum of the parts, where it actually transformed the consciousness of this community. And so doing things on a community level, working together, sharing results is really important for now, for how we're going to get this done. In Kansas, you have the Kansas Native Plant Society, which has a Facebook page. Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses has a website. These are useful resources. Where we live, we have a lot of counties have conservation at home programs, which is which helps people work together to pursue these things. We have in my community an organization called the Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee, which has a mentoring program where people with established native gardens mentor somebody to get their first one going. And within that mentoring committee, we have what we call the Helping Hands Committee, where we go out and we have work days on people's property, helping them out. And we also do consultations where we go to people's property, and the lovely lady in the blue shirt here is pointing at these yellow cone flowers and saying, "I think I have too many of these." And we tell her, "Yeah, tear them out." Because nobody had ever given her permission to remove perfectly good plants from her landscape. But it's important that you do that. It's a process called editing. It's just like when you write, you start off with way too many words, and then you take stuff out. And that it's a powerful tool that's really helped people, empower people to make positive changes in their landscapes. If you want to have something like this. Wild Ones is a national organization which has local chapters all over the country. Great resource. There's a chapter in Fayetteville, Arkansas, is the closest one I can find to you. But if you get enough people interested, you know, that's a potential, is to start a Wild Ones chapter to help spread the word. But their websites are great. They have YouTube channels, a lot of great information. So that you can have stuff like this happening in your yard. The Montgomery County Native Seed Saving and Exchange, I just learned about today, but this is a great example of a community project to, you know, spread information about native gardening and the beautiful things that can happen with it. Homegrown National Park. This is an initiative of Doug Talamy's, because he did the math and figured out that if we took half of the residential turf space in North America and converted it to habitat, it would be more acreage than almost all of our national parks combined, including like Denali, you know, some of the Everglades, some of the big ones. It's a lot of acreage that we have in turf grass, which is serving no function except we think it's nice to look at, but it could be so much nicer to look at. So that's a great model. And you can go on their website. If you have a native garden, you can go on your website, you can locate your property, and they're adding up, you know, trying to get to 50% of the residential turf of things that are like this. This is my front yard last summer. Here's some resources. You might want to just take a picture of that screen if you're interested. This Better Homes and Gardens Complete Guide to Gardening was my Bible at the park, and it's still an incredibly useful book. Things like Heather Holm. She has an Instagram account called Bees Native Plants, and it's a great resource. She's a very powerful educator. I learn a lot from Heather all the time. You can zoom in. If you go to her Instagram account and then look at who she follows, you'll find some really cool people doing good stuff. So those are all good resources. A little Wendell Berry quote: "The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope." I happen to agree with Wendell on that. Always remember to stop for lemonade stands. These guys are our future. And thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Yay.
Okay.
Did anyone have questions for?
Yes, questions.
Someone has a question. I do. I have a couple of questions.
Great.
My front yard is an old street here that has layers of brick underneath it. Can you?
I'm sorry.
Would you want to come up here? Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
It's just one second. Oh, no, you're. All right, so my front yard has layers of bricks underneath it because it's an old road.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Maybe an inch, 2 inches down max. And it's got several layers of brick. What can I plant on it besides clover? Because that seems to be the only thing that takes, without ripping up the whole front yard and digging everything up.
Wow. That's a good one. I think you might be surprised because there are gaps between those bricks. And these plants are really resourceful and will find those gaps. Man, that I can't tell you anything that I know will work. You know,
We have
but
got part of it, but the bricks are layered, horizontal this way, and then there's another layer that's
oh,
the opposite way. So
yeah.
you're locked.
I cannot say that I have good news for you. Yeah. But maybe you don't have to tear them all up, just make some holes through it, but yeah, that's a tough one. You said you had another question. Maybe I can help with that one.
I have my backyard goes almost to the other side of the block. And I have left it to grow wild for the past couple of years, and it has helped kill off some of the poison ivy that's back there.
Oh, wow.
Because I did spray for the first couple of years, but I didn't like the results. So I let it grow wild. It did kill off some of it, but it did not take care of what is wrapped around the old trees that I have on the property. Do you have any help to get rid of it that is not going to kill every bug in the vicinity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, things that are wrapping around the trees. What is it? I mean, the first thing in any pest control program is to identify the pest. So you have to find out what it is. Honeysuckle is a huge problem where you live. The sweet autumn clematis is a huge problem. And those are both fairly shallow rooted, and can be, manually ripped out of the ground.
And it was poison ivy.